All right, good people, welcome back. Let's make this happen. First things first, um, you know, happy holidays to all y'all good people. Uh, second thing, second, let's talk about what we're gonna get into today. So we've been chatting about the front end and the back end, right? We just started getting into back end programming and built out our first server. Props to us. Matter of fact, let me just go ahead and pull up some of that server side code to just talk a little bit about what we've been seeing over the last couple of sessions. So in our last session, we really worked on a number of server side um, a number of server side routes, right? And thinking about how do we create these routes in our Express applications that allow for us to receive data from a client, right? And so we talked a little bit about the different types of routes, namely GET routes versus POST request routes, and how basically with both of those types of routes, a client can make a request to our server, right? Long story short, we need these routes in our server in order for our client to be able to make particular requests. And so whatever request I want a client to make, I essentially have to write a particular route handler in my server so that it can process that request. The request is made up of a couple important things, and this happens in every server, right? One thing is, what is the HTTP request that the client will be making? What is the path the client is trying to reach? And then what is it that I want to do when the client reaches out for that particular path, right? What do I run? What code do I want to run? And what responses might I send back to the client in those cases? What we really talked about was that there was a big difference between how a client can make a GET request and a POST request into a server, right? And so in this case, on lines 27 and 32, you can see actually a very similar looking route. The difference being the type of method, right? One is a GET request versus one is a POST request, but they're both set to receive data at the same path. And that was done to illustrate in that last session how, again, you can have a server routing to any particular path. And so long as the route itself is different, the method of the route it's different, you can have different methods there. And GET requests function a little bit differently than POST requests. In a GET request, typically a client is just going to send a GET request to just receive some data back. In a POST request, it's typical that the client will be passing some data into the POST request, and we will then be using the POST request in order to manage that data. So a good example of that is here in this profile, where essentially the client we're expecting the client to pass us some data in the request body, right? And in this particular route handler, you can see that if a client makes a POST request to this particular route, what we're going to do is we're going to use the request body to essentially console log out what they sent us. And really, realistically, this route isn't doing something too terribly helpful. It basically is saying, hey, take the data that the client request sent us and then send it back to them as a JSON. So it basically will show that route's data, but it doesn't it's not doing anything too exciting. But the idea was meant to show GET requests, POST requests. These are the ways that a server might expect the client to send it some data. Now, with that being said, right, we understand how to launch the server, right? If I want to launch this server, I can open a terminal in this particular server side folder here that I created. And I say, okay, cool, I want to run the server. So I'm just going to go node index.js, and our app will start listening for traffic on that particular port. And then if I go to any of these particular routes, I would expect to have the route send some data back to whoever made those requests. So to illustrate this, I'm going to go to localhost 3000 in my browser and reshare this. Actually, localhost 3000 / I think it was profile. in the browser. And we're going to see in the browser that we're getting this little error here that says, hey, cannot get /profile, right? And the reason why is because in the browser, when we try to make a request through a URL here, we are only able to make one particular type of request. And I tried to drill this in y'all's head last time. So if you remember what it is, put in a comment, right? Or put in a chat, right? But the reality is when you're on the browser, there's only one type of request you can make through the browser, and that's a GET request, right? That's why you're seeing here, it says, hey, we cannot get /profile, right? Because if we go back to the server, you'll see that the profile route is meant to be a post request from the client. So in order to fix this, right, in order to test this route, we were using Postman, right? And if y'all remember Postman, I'll just open that up real quick. Postman is an application that allows for us to test different server-side routes and API calls in one application. What is helpful for is the fact that through Postman, right, when it finally loads, through Postman, we can test any type of HTTP request that that we're particularly interested in. So in Postman now, I have the ability to say, okay, cool, I'm going to test a GET request, or I'm going to test a POST request, right? And in this POST request, I can do things like say, hey, I want to actually pass a body of data, and that data might include some profile information. And when I send this and post this, right, this is going to reach out to our, oh, wait, my bad. The route was /profile. This is going to reach out to our server, and right, we're going to get back that JSON from the server. If you recall, the regular just kind of root route says, hey, got a post request. That also kind of, we can look back at that code to see that, hey, you know, when I said above here to send this app.post, right, it would send back got a post request. The point I'm trying to make is that when you're on a client side application and you're looking to make these types of requests that aren't GET requests, you can't do it just by going to the URL in the browser, which means that you have to use other methods for connecting to your backend, right? So for you developers who are used to building out these front-end applications, you might be wondering, well, how do I connect data? How do I connect my particular client-side application to the server-side application such that I can either get the data that I want or post data that I need and receive these responses back from the servers that I'm working on? And that's exactly what we're going to talk through today is how do we build these applications such that we can connect and communicate with our servers, right? So that's my goal for today. So to do this, I want to take us back to a simpler time, a time before there were servers and when it was just client-side application, right? And so to do that, what I'm going to do is open up a client-side application that we've been working on in our time together, which is this Favelinks application. And if you recall, the Favelinks application is just a simple app that we started that was meant to be a, basically it was meant to allow for us to create a container that had a table and a form, and the form and the table basically submitted data from one to another. So the form, a user would type in the form and then send data to the table. The table would basically receive that data and visualize it for us. To better show this off, you know, it's always better to see these things. I'm going to remind us all, hey, you know, this was a client-side React application that we built, and the way that we built it was using Vite. So in order to run it, I'm just going to use the Vite dev command to start this up. So I'm just going to say npm run dev. And remember that this is going to call this particular script that's inside of our package.json that starts the application on a local server, funny enough. So can't really get away from the server side too far yet, but bear with me, y'all, bear with me. The point I'm trying to make here is like, let's just look at this from the client side and pretend we're just building a client side application. We're not even worried about our server as of right now. So now on localhost colon 5173, it looks like my application is running. So if I go back to my browser and I pull up localhost 5173, I would expect to see my little Favelinks application. And here it is, right? The way the application worked was I could go here, I could type in a link name and a link URL like github.com and submit. And if it wasn't bugging, we'd have something submitted here. But clearly there's a little error here. So let's just take a look at what the code is supposed to do and fix that up so that we can test our app the right way. So the way that the app was structured was there were three, and I might have just closed my terminal unintentionally, but there were three components, right? There's the link container and the table and our form, right? Every time a user goes to the form, what we expect to have happen is that the user is able to essentially change the information in the form and eventually submit that form, the form's data back to the link container. So we pass down in the link container, we pass down a prop to the form called submit new link, which realistically is going to call this handle submit function. So anytime submit new link gets called, we'll call handle submit and pass in some data. This data is meant to basically be added to our array here. And it looks like maybe that particular part of this wasn't working. So let me just go back to this, refresh, make sure this is still running. Okay. And just for the interest of time, I don't want to rebuild this whole application. Maybe I was playing with this because I see I have another thing commented out up here. So let me just do this, make sure that that is all good. Okay, cool. All right, bet. So don't mind my janky code that was being tested, but we can see here that clearly this is gonna work now. So essentially the user was able to add a link name and a link URL, and when they submitted it, it would add to this table. Very simple stuff that we wanted to just use in order to get the ball rolling. So what I want to talk about though is how can we then connect an application, client-side application, whether it's this application or another application, to our backend, right? And perform some of the types of requests that we were just performing in Postman, right? And the reality is that in order to do that, it's not that hard. We just need to make use of some JavaScript that we haven't actually talked too much about yet. Because the reality is, hey, in the browser, we can do certain things just in the URL bar, but how can I programmatically call some of those requests, right? And the truth is, you can do that fairly easily in JavaScript. And today we're gonna learn how to do that. One thing though that I'd love to show y'all in order to do this is how it might work if there was data housed somewhere else that we wanted to use. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to pull a list of these fave links and say, hey, there's like maybe a list of 3 or 5 fave links to start that I wanted to pull into my application when the application is starting. So rather than start from scratch, right, when the app first loads, everything is kind of empty. Right? What if I want to start with maybe a couple links, and instead of having those links hard coded in my code base, what if I wanted to pull those links from somewhere, like a server, hey, maybe there's some links saved somewhere else and I want to pull those into this app. So that's exactly what we're going to work on doing right now. So to do that, we're going to use 2 different parts. We're going to work on this in 2 different parts. The first part, we'll start with the client and then we'll do the server. And Actually, we'll start with the server, then we'll do the client. Just so that it makes sense when we use the client, where we're gonna get this data from, right? So buckle up, and if you're ready to rock with me, all you're gonna need, if you are ready to rock with me, look, you're gonna need two things. You're gonna need your Favelinks project if you have one, or a similar client-side project that you're interested in working with. It can be running on your local dev server. That's fine. And you're gonna need some Express server that you built recently. In our case, I just showed y'all earlier that we did have like a little Express server that we started with a couple test routes in here. So I'll be using this one, but I'll walk you through it as if you're building one from scratch, just in general, so that it won't take us too long to build a new server. But the idea is I want to save some time, so I'll just use this server that we already launched. But I'll talk you through if you were to be rebuilding this server yourself. So those are the two things you're going to need: one client-side application and one server that you have. And if you are gonna follow along and rock with your boy, just give me a thumbs up, show me some love, you know what I'm saying? And we will jump right in. All right, look at y'all. Okay, Brave. Okay, homies, look at y'all. Okay, let's do it then. All right, cool. So let me break this down real quick for the folks who are like, okay, I love this part of the times when you talk and you just like show us all stuff, but I wish you could just show us it very fast so I know what it is, and then I'll tune you out for the rest of the class. And I'm like, I bet I got you. So if you're trying to make some server-side calls in JavaScript, there's two particular ways to do it. One way to do it is using the fetch library, which is built into JavaScript. Now, fetch is what we would call an API, right? API basically is an interface that allows for two programs to connect to one another. One program would use an API to connect to a different program. And we'll talk all about APIs in general, because I'm sure hearing that word, y'all are like, oh, I need to know about APIs. You're right. But fetch is essentially a built-in set of methods within JavaScript that will allow for us to create HTTP requests. Just browsing through this real quick, because I don't want to read y'all the whole documentation. Fetch API uses request and response objects, as well as related concepts such as cores and the HTTP origin header semantics. Okay, very theoretical. But if y'all remember our servers, you might recall request and response objects are very important in our server, right? We need to use those two types of objects in order to send and receive the data from our client and our server, right? Basically, the fetch method takes some arguments, including the path to a resource you want to fetch. It returns what's called a promise that resolves to the response to that request. As soon as the server responds with headers, even if the server response is an HTTP error status. Once the response is retrieved, there are a number of methods available to define what the body content is and how it should be handled. You can create a request and response directly using a request and response constructors, but blah, 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 blah. So the fetch interface allows for us to, and I'm sure they have an example in here somewhere. The fetch interface allows for us to call a method that will allow for us to basically programmatically create our HTTP requests like we've been talking about. Typically in the Mozilla docs, they'll have like, okay, here's a little example, and I got to charge my computer. In this little example, right? In this little example, we can see a couple little different things going on. But the fetch request, let's see. I just want like the simplest fetch example that they got. They're not as simple. They're not gonna be as simple as me showing y'all. But essentially, we're gonna use this fetch request library to create a request to a particular URL and get back some data. So that's number one. If you are like, oh, I've heard of some other methods that we could use to get back data. The reality is there are also other libraries that you can use to do a similar thing, but those libraries require you to install them as packages in your project, whereas Fetch is just pre-built into the JavaScript. The reality is, even in these crazy looking examples, right, how we use the fetch request is we use fetch to make a request to a particular piece of data. And then we can get back some of the information from that request. Rather than go through this complicated looking thing right now that won't make more sense, it will make more sense if we kind of walk through it together. So for those of y'all who are like, okay, well, just tell me what I got to use. Here's what you got to use. And if you want to learn how to use it, stick around. You know what I'm saying? Stick around. That's what we're here for. All right, bet. So we're going to use this library, the fetch library, right? And it's built into JavaScript. It's going to do a lot of stuff for us. Essentially, what it's going to do is, if we go back to Postman real quick, it's going to do what Postman is doing for us in structuring out a request to a particular path on an existing server. So remember, the way Postman worked was we just typed in, hey, I want to get this data from localhost 3000, right? And when I said I could set up some particular parameters, I could say, hey, this is a post request. Hey, I have a body and some data that I want to pass into this post request, and then I can send the request, right? Just like I can do all these things with this interface on Postman, I can do the same thing programmatically using JavaScript in the fetch library. The only caveat is that I need to, call a route on a server that exists, right? If I call a route that didn't exist, like this route that doesn't exist, right, and send this, I'm going to get some errors that just are going to say stuff like, hey, like, cannot post this. Hey, this isn't a route. This, 404 not found, etc. Right? So long as I'm posting to or getting data or sending a request to a particular route that exists, everything should be all good and dandy, right? And so here's what we're gonna do next. Our goal is to basically, one, make sure that there's a route on our server that will exist for us to call for the sake of what we're trying to do. Second, we're going to use the client side and we call fetch in order to get that data. So let's start with number one, which is making sure that there's a route that exists on our server for the sake of what we're trying to do. So here's what I mean by that, right? On our server right now, and this server is a simple Express server. So for anyone who's like curious about Express servers, you maybe never have built one. The idea is Express is a library in JavaScript that you can use to basically create a server. And what Express does is it creates an application for you. That application has a defined port, and then you can add particular middleware to that application. We'll get into that in a second. But the reality is the main point of your application is for you to define these routes. And routes are, like we talked about a little earlier, essentially just little blocks that define what client-side method is being called, what route is being called on that client-side method, and what is the function or the handler that will be called when that particular path and method are requested from the client. So all routes have a similar structure. As you can see, here's one for a post request to the profile path. On line 27, you see a GET request to just the regular root route. You see a post request to the root route, right? We did a GET request to a route called test. I'm not sure what this one returns. It's supposed to return some HTML. And the point is, right, all of these routes are going to send back some data based on what it receives, right? Give me a thumbs up if that makes sense to you, just given what we've been talking about with servers so far, right? All these routes are basically listening for a path and are going to send some data back based on the path that it hears, someone saying, hey, I want to go to this particular path of data, right? So what I'm saying I need is a route for the sake of what I'm trying to accomplish, which is I want a route that will send back some data based on the links, like those fave links. So just like some simple test data, right? So to do that, like what I'm imagining is it would be great if I had like a little route, like, like get/fave links /data or something, right? And when that route gets called, right, I want the server to have a little function that says, hey, when this route gets called and we get a client request and I'm about to generate a response, what I'd like to do is send back, and as a response, right, res.send, it would be great if I could send, some data back. And right now, data doesn't really exist, right? But the idea is I can make it exist here on the server by just saying something like this, like const data, and I want this to be a little array. And in this array, I'm going to just define a couple FaveLink objects, right? The idea in the FaveLinks project was that each object consisted of a name and a URL, right? And that was the point. The form was creating a name and URL object and sending it to our table. So here, I'm just going to create some for myself, just as like some baseline pieces of data. So I'm going to just put, my website and say, something like, or let's just say my GitHub, because that's more popping. And then I'll just put github.com/community, right? Put another one in here, name, and I'm going to say my biz website, right? And say URL, florialabs.org, right? And even that is enough to start. But basically, as you can see, this is just an array of some objects. And the objects are just, they have a name and a URL. Both of them are strings, right? In the server side context, this piece of data is just some data, right? That's really all it is. But when I decide to send this data, right, that's when things get a little interesting, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this as it is right now. We're going to come back here and change it in a quick second, but I just want to show y'all what will happen if we send this data back. So here I'm going to say, okay, boom, I saved this. And now I have this new route. It says app.get/favelink/data. And I define some data and I'm sending that data, right? Hopefully that makes sense and it doesn't seem overwhelming, right? What I'm going to do next is I have to stop the server that I had running because I just made a change. So because I made a change, the server that's running is no longer running with the latest changes. So I have to stop the server by doing Control-C in the terminal window that had it open and restart the server by calling node index.js again, so that the server restarts listening for traffic. Now, the last thing I want to do is test this route, right? And we talked about there's a couple different ways for me to test it, right? Because this is a GET request, I could just go in the browser and say, hey, browser, go to this route and see. And another way is for me to use Postman. So what I'm going to do, I'll do both just so we can see kind of what happens on both sides. So I'm going to copy that path and I'm going to go back to my browser, to our little server. So remember, I had the client side running on one thing, but the server is running on, I believe, port 3000. So I'm going to go to localhost 3000 with the path that I just typed in, /favelink/data. And when I go here, y'all can see that I'm getting back some data, right? That data is coming back to me as a little array of data. This data type that's coming back is actually JSON. So the server is responding with some data, and our FaveLinks app is processing this and sending it back to us and showing us this piece of data here. So here's what I want y'all to do. On your server, if you're following along, take some time real quick and just create a new route in your server that is responsible for sending back some data. You can define that data similar to how I did, just change some of the URLs or whatever. But the point is send some data that we're eventually going to hopefully get back inside of our FaveLinks application. When you got that and you tested the route and made sure that it's working, just raise your hand so I know that we're all on the same page. And if you're not going to follow along, but this makes sense, just give me a thumbs up so I know that that makes sense to you as well. Thanks. Thank you. Appreciate y'all. Yeah. So yeah, continue to just raise your hands as you're finishing those little routes up. That way I just know y'all following with me. Nice. Great job. All right, good people. I'll wait another minute or so, just for folks who are live coding with me. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat while we wait. Otherwise, we will get it popping in a quick couple seconds. Cool. Awesome. All right, y'all. Well, shout outs to those of y'all who got that going. I'll go ahead, I'll drop this into the chat in case folks are still working and want just some extra help there. Cool. So we have this server, right? And the server itself is responding, the server itself has a route that's very specific to us, us sending this data and getting this data back into our application. So now the question is, how can we make it such that we can call and get this information from our client side application, right? Like now the goal is, okay, well, can I get this data back in the client side, right? Because the goal is to not just have, the goal isn't just to have the data here. We want to actually have some of this information accessible from in our application. So here's what we're going to do. So now that we have this data, now we're like, okay, well, boom, like, can we call this data from the client side? So first step is accomplished. We have a route that is related to what we want to get back data wise, right? This is sending some data. The other point I was going to mention here is you can see here I'm using the send method, and the send method will allow me to just send back some data just like I'm doing. There's another method that's very specific to sending JSON data, which is res.json. If I use the .json, it will send specifically JSON data. So if I know that, hey, I want this piece of data to be considered like data and not mistaken for HTML at all, I can say, hey, instead of res.send data, I can say, hey, res.json and send the data that way. Just pointing that out to y'all so that y'all are aware if you see either, right? The send allows us to just send generally some data. The JSON is very specific. Hey, I want to send data that is going to be encoded as JSON, which is helpful for our applications. So right now, I'm just going to go ahead and just swap that to just be res.json. I'm going to save that inside of the server since I made a quick change. I'm going to restart the server so that that change is going to take part in that. All right, cool. So the next step is now we're good on the server side. So if you recall, right, we kind of got two things going on right now, right? On the one hand, we have this client-side application that's running on localhost 5173. And then we have the server-side application that's running on localhost 3000. Basically, the client-side application is our Vite application that we've been working with, and our localhost 3000 is that express server that we've been building out. So we have two particular applications that we're working on. Now that we finished these changes on the server side, we have a little bit of data coming back, right? Let's figure out how can we get this data, to show up on our client side. And so that's what we're going to focus on next. So boom. To do this, we're going to switch gears and go back to our client side code base, which is for me this like favlinks application here, right? So here's where we start getting some interesting bit of front end code focused on server side, communicating with our server side. So basically, in our front end, we want to be able to reach out and create a request to that particular route that we just made on the server, right? For me, that route was localhost 3000 slash favlink slash data, right? And I want to be able to make that request and get that information inside of the client. So it would be very cool if, like, as our application is like loading, right, we were able to, you know, call some method that doesn't really exist right now, like fetch data or something, right? And fetch data is a function, and that function will be responsible for, you know, grabbing some data from our server to use in that. And I'm actually going to move it down a little bit because didn't expect it to be all the way up there. Like, you know, maybe above our handle remove before stuff, right? Like, we just want to be able to call fetch data, grab some data from our server using the app, and, you know, establish some favlinks, right? So essentially, it'd be great if I could use this function to do what we just talked about. Go to that server that we just called and that route that we just made and pull that data into our application. Now, to do this, we can actually use that fetch library that I told y'all that exists in JavaScript. Basically, right, if I say fetch, I'm just going to use the fetch, and you can see as I typed it in, it popped up in VS Code. The fetch library is fetch right now is a pre-built-in function in JavaScript that we can use. So if I just call fetch as a function and hover over it, we're going to get some helpful information from VS Code as to what does this function expect to receive. So one of the things it expects to receive is an input of a URL, right? So it needs a URL to get some information from. The other thing is expecting is some request information, right? What are we passing into the request as information for it to receive? Now, the fetch request itself is structured in a very pretty simple way, where essentially the fetch request wants you to say, hey, what type of request, what what is the place that we want to get this data from? Like, where are we getting this data? What's the path of the data that we're trying to receive? So a simple fetch request would basically look something like a simple fetch request would basically look like us saying, okay, cool, like maybe I have in this, maybe I have a website, it's like example.com/movies, you know what I'm saying? And this particular website has some data for me. So with a fetch request, I can say fetch data from this particular URL, right? This could be an external API, like if I was using the Pokemon API, I think it's like pokeapi.com/Pokemon/Pikachu or something like that, right? Like I could get data back from an external API. I could get back data from a particular website, right? If it's Google, it'd actually be HTTPS, right? So the fetch request takes in anything as a parameter to make a particular request. In our case, right, the request that we want to make is to a local host server that we have on our machine. But let's say for now, just to kind of get the ball rolling, let's test it with a website that actually exists externally, like Google or something, and just see what comes back, right? So in this case, I'm going to say fetch google.com, right? And let's just see what happens. So I have this function, fetch data, but now I have to ask myself, how am I going to call this function, right? On the front end, especially in these React applications, right? In the React app, it's not really common that you're just going to have a function, you're just going to call it just out of the blue. We want to call it with relationship to how our component is being structured, right? Our component right now has a couple of helpful methods that are tied to it, but those get called through the various components, other custom components that we created, right? Handle submit is a function that gets called when the form submits a new link, right? Handle remove is supposed to get called within our table, right? When remove link gets called, we're supposed to call handle, whatever that was, handle remove, right? So those functions only really exist in the scope of the those functions only really exist in the scope of these components. So how then do you call a function that isn't necessarily part of just your component itself, but more like, hey, I want to call this when the component is like maybe like loading or something, right? To do this, we can use another hook in React that we hadn't talked about previously, but is really important for the sake of calling methods at different points within the component's life cycle, for better words, right? And when I say life cycle, I mean, hey, at some point, this component, our link container, has to be created, right? It has to be put onto the screen. And the screen has to know, hey, we're going to put all these different elements on there, right? So that's a part of the component life cycle, as well as, if I ever went to a different page, this component would have to be taken away from the screen, right? And there is another part of the component lifecycle, right? A method that is going to be really helpful for y'all to know of in general is the use effect hook in React. Now, the use effect hook is a hook that we use in order to, we use it in a lot of different ways, right? One way that the use effect hook is really useful for is, let's say I want to run a function when a value in the state changes. I could use a use effect hook to basically say, hey, when this value in state changes, run this function. So that's one way that it's used. It's used to monitor when state is being changed and do something. Another time that use effect hook is used is for instances like what we're talking about here, which is, hey, a component is just finished loading and we want to run some function. So in that case, I might say, okay, boom, let me use a use effect hook in order to call something. Beyond that, the use effect hook is really helpful for monitoring data that's changing inside of a component over time, whether that data is in props or in state, and basically calling a function or some functions inside of it inside of the use effect when those things happen. It's common, you'll see a lot of different use effects in an app, but each might be calling itself in a very specific moment in time. For us, let's get practice with this use effect by creating a use effect for what we want to do with relationship with calling this external API, right? So in my case, what I'd like to do is I need to create a use effect hook, and then I'd like to, inside of that use effect hook, basically fetch some data. So what I want to do first is basically create the use effect. And so a use effect hook is essentially a simple function. That function is going to the function itself is going to be responsible for essentially calling back a separate function that is a separate function that will be called when data changes inside of our component. The idea is that the idea with the use effect hook and how it works is that a use effect hook takes in, as you can see, callback, which is basically the function, right, that we're trying to call. And we can pass also a dependency list. Now, a dependency list is essentially, as you can see here, it says if present, the effect will only activate if the values in the list change. So what you'll typically see for a use effect is a use effect will be structured kind of like this, where you call use effect, pass in a function, and then you'll see a comma and what looks like an empty array. Inside of this array is where folks will determine particular values of different pieces of data that it wants to monitor. Typically, those values will be things like state. So if I wanted a use effect to run whenever like my favelink's state value changes, my use effect might be looking like something like this, right? This use effect basically has a dependency. That's the favelink's array that says, hey, if this array changes, then, or if this piece of data changes, I should say, then that's when this use effect will be called. This effect will be called. If you leave it blank, what happens is this will run without any dependencies, and it will be called essentially when the application first renders, which is the case I was talking about before, where it's like, okay, we just finished loading. Let's call our effect to say that we finished that particular process, right? So boom. So we have this use effect, and the idea is we want to use that use effect to call our fetch data function. Essentially, one more thing I'm going to do is, because the fetch data function, this doesn't necessarily matter, but because the fetch data is above this, I'm going to actually move my use effect stuff down closer to the return. And here is where I'll just kind of call some stuff. So in order to work with this fetch request, it's important to understand what's going to happen when this fetch request gets called. So let me just go back to the Mozilla reference for y'all, and let's talk through a little bit more what happens when we make a particular fetch request, right? So a fetch request, I just want to see another example of that, fan. Actually, let me do this. W3 Schools probably has a better example. So boom. Cool. So okay, well, it doesn't do it in the best way, but basically a fetch request, when you're fetching data online, man, I want to show it to y'all in a better way because it will be helpful to see this. Let me do it actually still through the Mozilla docs. So a fetch request itself is calling this fetch method. The fetch method is asking for some resource and it's going to give back some data for that particular resource. This is what I'm talking about when I say the resource is basically just the URL to the object that we want to get, or essentially what we want to, the path to the resource we're trying to get. The options that we can pass into the fetch will just allow for us to better customize that request. So this will allow us to say specific things like, hey, I want to use a post request, or I want to use a GET request, right? The default is GET. So if there's no options passed into the fetch, it's going to assume we're doing a GET request. When we want to make a post request, which we'll see a little later, we have to pass extra information to that post request. If it will entertain me and give me a little example. So I wish these examples were just a little bit simpler, but it's all good. In the example here where we're making this fetch request, right? So let's just kind of scroll down a little bit. In the example of here, we're making this fetch request. A couple things happen in relationship to how a fetch request works. What we're doing here is called an asynchronous method. An asynchronous method basically means that we're going to call data on another running process in a different place. Because that data is running on a separate process, we don't necessarily know when that other process will return back with all the data we need finished, right? So to handle that in JavaScript, what we use are called promises. And I'm sure they have the word promise up here somewhere, because this is typically where folks get first introduced to promises. And a promise basically is a particular JavaScript object that a promise is a particular JavaScript object that we use with asynchronous. Here it says a promise here, but it doesn't want to show us what a promise is really. But a promise is essentially a particular JavaScript object that gets called back during asynchronous operations. So I make a request to another process. That process will return with a promise. The promise is basically built in order to give you back a return value, but that promise will resolve itself over time when the asynchronous process is done. So this gets a little confusing. Trust me, even a lot of older and more seasoned devs still probably have a hard time explaining what promises do, unless you're talking about how they just call some functions that use them. But the idea of a promise, whenever anything returns a promise in JavaScript, there's 3 states of the particular promise that the promise can be. One state is pending, right? So when you first get back a promise value, it's going to be pending. It's going to say, hey, you got a promise back. But it's pending, which means that the asynchronous operation hasn't completed yet. The other option for the promise will be fulfilled. If the asynchronous response finishes up, we made our request, we got that data back, it'll say, hey, fulfilled. We finished the promise, we got back stuff. Now, if the promise executes, but then something messes up within the process of getting that data back, we'll get back a rejected, or it's something that says, hey, the operation failed. So because a fetch request is an asynchronous method, what happens is the way we break down the data we receive is a little weird. And we used to use a very interesting syntax to get back all of this promise data and to check whether the promise was complete or not. And it was revolving around using these .then methodologies here. So here you can see, if I was to fetch a file, then I would be chaining these .then in order to get back data from the promise. Now, trust me, if you're confused hearing me say that, it is a confusing process, right? Basically, you don't get back the initial value you need from a promise unless you use .then in order to get back the result of the promise, right? So basically, the .then referred to, hey, fetch this file, and when the promise resolves, then do this. And if this method also has a promise that needs to resolve, Then when that method with a promise is done, then we'll do something else, right? So you can imagine that if you had a lot of different promises being called in different functions, right? You'd have a lot of these chained methods. And that was exactly what it was. And if we go back to the Mozilla network documentation for the fetch, right? And we looked at some of those examples down there, that's exactly what you're going to see there, right? Is if I could find it, right? Is okay, boom, fetch my request and then get back my response. And if the response is okay, cool, we're good. Or if the response is not okay, hey, we're gonna do something. Otherwise, hey, if the response is good, then we can return the response. And because .blob is another promise, then we're gonna have to do another chained method to get back some data. It's all very confusing. But the good news is JavaScript was updated in ways that made it easier to deal with these promise methods in ways that are built into like the newer versions of JavaScript. So it might be the case that you're going to work with some promises. You're going to see some .thens and catches and stuff like that being put into your code. But for now, it's more common to use another syntax in order to deal with these asynchronous methods in your particular code base, which is the async await syntax. So in the async await syntax, right, we basically get to mark any function that returns a promise as an asynchronous function. This asynchronous function then allows for us to use this await syntax to say, hey, we're going to set some data to be the result of a promise being called, and we're going to await that promise being called. And so instead of having to chain a bunch of .thens, we can just use the await syntax to call a promise, a function that returns a promise, almost like a regular function, right? And set data a little bit more easily. So this is exactly how we're going to do it in ours, just so that y'all are aware. I just wanted to make sure that y'all were aware of the promise-based way of the .then-based approach of getting back data. But it's more common to see people using the async await syntax nowadays. And even if you looked it up online, I'm sure a bunch of examples might show you these things in async await. So let's talk about how this gets is going to work for us, right? So if we go back to our particular bit of code, right, our little Favelinks code where we're working with this fetch method, right? Anytime you want to check if a function is going to return a promise, VS Code makes it super easy because it puts the docs right inside of these things. If you hover over the function, right, especially like external library function like fetch or something, you can see, hey, this is going to return a promise here at the end. It shows us here. So because of that, it's methods like these that will require us to use things like async await in order to call them in more readable ways. So to do this, what I'm going to do is every fetch request is going to send back a response, right? When we send a request to a server, we typically get back a response. So what I'm going to say is, okay, cool. Well, I want to get a response that is going to basically get the result of this fetch request. To do this in a way that is going to be easy for me to understand, or it's not easy for me to understand, to do this in a way where it's going to actually work appropriately, I need to make sure I await the asynchronous method that happens in this particular fetch request. To do that, I have to do two things. The first thing is I have to mark this function, this fetch data function that I'm writing, as an asynchronous function. To do that, I have to say before this function is declared, I have to mark it as async. So in a function that's an arrow function, it'd look like this, like right before the parentheses in the arrow, you'd say async. If there was an old school function, like kind of like this, right? If I had a function like this, right, I would mark async like this. So async functions are Async functions are basically functions that are marked with the asynchronous keyword. And then we use the fact that these are async functions to use the await syntax inside of the particular function. So in my case, because this is an arrow function, the syntax looks a little bit like this, where basically I'm marking this function as asynchronous. And you can see that anytime you mark a function as async, it's going to say, okay, this function is going to be returning a promise. In my case, because now that I marked this function as asynchronous, I can do the async await syntax to say basically, okay, cool. Let's get our response back from our fetch request going to Google like so. And when we get back that response, right, what I want to do is I basically want to just console log the response for now, just to see kind of what comes back. So now I have this function. It's called fetch data. It's async function. We have a fetch request that's going to be made. And when that asynchronous response is finished, right, we're saving it to a variable called response. And then I can console log the response, right? Looking at this, right, you might be like, well, that was a lot of talking for just 2 lines of code, right? But the point I was trying to make is, in order to deal with asynchronous methods, us calling data from the client to the server, you're going to deal with promises in JavaScript. That's just a fact, right? So you can either go the route of using async await and having your syntax look a little bit cleaner. So it's like, oh, I'm calling a variable to get back the data from the fetch. Or it would look a little bit something like us doing something like, fetch google.com, then, with a response, right? Then we can, then with this response, we can have something else happen, right? And typically this would be kind of how, this would be like how that same thing would be structured if it was like a .then syntax, right? So a little bit more awkward to read, if you ask me, which is why I wanted to introduce y'all instead of doing it that way. Naturally, do it the way that's a little bit easier, right? So that's why I had all that talking. So cool. So this fetch data function is meant to just essentially just go reach out to a server, grab the data, and console log the response. That's all that this function is meant to do, right? Now I just have to call it, right? So now I say, hey, fetch data is declared, but its value is never read, right? So all I'm missing now is in this use effect to call my fetch data function. And so by putting in the use effect, right? Remember, the use effect will run when the component first loads. Then it's going to call fetch data. And so the goal would be that fetch data runs, it goes, grabs this data, and we console log out some response. So I'm going to save this. Let's go take a look at let's take a look at our application. I'm gonna refresh it, and I have to open up our application in the inspector to just see if this all works. And getting some errors. Cool. So here we're getting some interesting errors, right? And you'd think that this would be a little bit easier, but alas, nothing is easy when you're starting to code. Essentially, we're going to get some errors as we're working on this, right? And basically, the errors that we're getting are related to us making a fetch request. So good news is we're making a fetch request. We're trying to make a fetch request at least, but we're not able to actually get the data. We're not actually able to get this data, right? And we're getting this really interesting error here that's saying, hey, access to fetch at google.com from origin has been blocked by the CORS policy. We don't have the ability to grab this data from Google. A CORS error is an error that we will run into again and again when it comes to dealing with external APIs, right? essentially what this error is saying is that the server is not permitting us to get this data back, right? And it's partially because we're not on a server. We're not calling this data in a way that Google is like cool with. And when I say cool with, basically I mean that the server needs to allow for us to get this data back. And interestingly enough, right, if I go back to our code and let's just, for the sake of getting back into what we were doing this originally for, right? If I wanted to say, hey, I wanted to get this data from, localhost 3000, right? Even then, right, and save this now and refresh, we're still going to have a little bit of some errors, right? Oh, my bad. We're still going to have those same errors, right? Where we're not able to get back this information because of what's called a CORS request issue. Now, CORS is a very tricky part of also fetching data, which basically is the case that there are security parameters built into the web where you can't basically request information from a different server and share data across that way without the server allowing that data to be shared that way. So that's a long way to say, in order to fix this, we need to change one more thing within our server in order to basically allow for requests to be made from a different origin, right? I know that sounds like a lot of really interesting kind of big words, but the idea is one origin is basically localhost 3000 and the other origin is localhost 5173. And basically there's a security parameter on the web that says, hey, by default, you can't actually send data from one origin server to a different one, right? Unless we pass some information in on a specific header of that particular request. So basically, we need to essentially change some things on our server in order for us to make some of these requests actually work the way we would expect them to. So to do that, we're going to do one last thing in order to get back some of this data, at least from the from our on our server. And it should be fairly simple, but like I said, things somehow tend to not be simple when you're live coding. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go back to our server, right? And remember, our server right now is just kind of a couple of routes that we defined. But what we want to do is we want to basically allow for us to tell our server that no matter what origin is reaching out for the data, that we want to allow it to be able to use to get the data back from the server. To do that, and there's reasons why you might not want to do this, and the reasons why are security. You might want to say, hey, I actually don't want people who are external to a particular site to get back this data, right? But in some regards, when you're doing local development and you want an API from your local host to work together, you want the local host on one machine to be able to talk to the other one and get back this data. And this is a case where there's a couple ways we could get around this, but I want to teach you the one that is going to be most impactful, which is using a package inside of your server that's called CORS. And CORS basically would be allowing for us to get rid of this error that's saying, hey, we actually can't get back this data from your particular server, right? So to do this, what I want to do is on the server, I want to stop the server first of all, so I get back into the terminal. And the next thing I want to do is I want to install a package called CORS. CORS is a very simple node package typically when you're working with Express, it's very common that you're going to install cores as well with Express. But cores is what we call a middleware for Express. And we kind of talked about middleware last time we linked up, where we said, hey, middleware are kind of like these little in-between our server running and our server responding with routes. Middleware can be called to process some stuff, right? Maybe that middleware is basically creating some static files for us. Or in the case of cores, that middleware can be basically configuring our routes so that they can receive data from other origins from our local host or something. So what I want to do next is, after creating Express, right? I want to make sure that I bring in, I want to import cores into the project as well. So I'm just going to say cores and require cores like this. All right. Next, we have our app for Express. And just like I was adding middleware here, the next thing I want to do is add some middleware to use cores. So I'm just going to tell our app, hey, you're going to use cores just like this. So now that I am using cores, I want to basically tell my application, hey, in this particular route, we're going to use cores to send back some data. Let that data be sent. So you can use cores either in your entire app, or you can use cores specifically on specific routes. To do that, all you got to do is go to the particular route that you want. And in my case, it's this Favelinks data route that I want to configure. And after the route is configured and we say our path, right? Before we call our function, we're going to actually, call cores. And we're going to say, cores is going to be called as a piece of middleware, and we're going to pass our function in as another object within this sense. So in this case, what I'm doing is hopefully configuring cores in order to run, configuring cores to run on this particular route. So now I want to save this. I want to relaunch our server, and I want to go back and check in our client side application, right? If I go to localhost 5173 and let's see, refresh. So now I'm caught. Is it still getting this course policy? So, dang, of course it'll do this to me. Of course. Basically, and I'm be vulnerable and say it happens like this, right? As soon as you start trying to manipulate data from one part of the server to the next, you're gonna have these little issues come up where everything should work and you're like, oh, well, boom, now I'm getting this cores error, right? And the cores error basically is going to be you troubleshooting, making sure cores is running correctly on your application. So I'm going to go back to the server side. Let's just make sure that I have everything here running as I would expect. Matter of fact, let me just test in, and this is also what makes Postman very helpful is, to just test and configure, make sure that our routes are working as we would expect. So let me just slash, what was it? Favelink/data. Send this. Okay, so this is still working here in Postman, which is good. So that's a good sign. And that gives me some hope. That gives me some hope that, okay, well, it's working here in Postman. And this actually is a great time to actually bring up one really other cool feature about Postman that I really like, which is in Postman, not only can you create these like fake requests, or not fake requests, you can run these requests in Postman, if you see on the kind of like is nested underneath the send, there's a code button. If you click the code button, you can actually see some of the code for how to present, basically how to present your requests in specific ways through Postman. So it'll show you stuff like, hey, okay, you're making a fetch request to localhost 3000 fetch data. It shows you this request options thing and how it's calling your method. But the difference is Postman puts in specific other pieces of data into your requests that typically you might not put in general to your request. But I just want you to know that let's say you were like, hey, I forgot how to structure this fetch request, right? You can use Postman to show you a little bit more how that works in just through there. So, okay, cool. So at least this route is working, which is good. But that just leads me to believe that I didn't set this up in the best way on my server. So bear with me, fam. Let's think. Let me think. Because you would not even believe me when I say this is this is how it is. This is how it goes. So let me think. What I might do is actually call the cores in a different way. So let's see. So I have my data, and I want to run this. I want to get back this data. Bam, I'm getting the cores error. Oh, maybe what I gotta do is in this, just kind of, let me try one more thing. Put the and I'll talk about this in a second if this works. All right, let's see. Let me go back here. No, that didn't fix it. Well, fam, this is these are the highs, these are the lows. These are the highs, these are the lows. Here's what we'll do. I don't want to waste y'all's time as I'm troubleshooting this. I don't know why it's breaking right now. But what I'll do is I'm gonna pause here, right? We're in a good place. Essentially, we have our server, we have our data in our server, and the last step is pulling the data into our site, our local host site. Clearly, I'm getting some chorus errors. So I'm gonna fix the chorus errors, and in our next session on Wednesday, we'll go through this in an easier to see way because I'll have it all ready for you. But yeah, essentially, just to make it clear what we got to do. Whenever we're sending data to and from the server, in order to allow other sites to pull that data from the server, we have to enable cores on our site. That's simply how it is. But enabling cores might require a couple different little tweaks to, and maybe one of the tweaks that I should have did was restart the server because I just changed it. And let's see if that fixed it, because if that fixed it, then that would be dope. But nah, that didn't fix it. Did it fix it? No, that didn't fix it. Anyway, there's little tweaks I got made to the code to just get the cores to run. Cores itself is a fairly simple package, but as you can see, you still deal with these little struggles here and there when you're working with your backend services. So what we'll do is we'll pause here because we're in a good place. Like I said, all we got to do is connect the cores, and then we can go back to our front end, pull this data down, and realistically, see, I'm uncovering way more data. So way more issues. One other issue here is I was calling a route that doesn't have cores in there, right? Because the route that I did put cores in was this one, /favlink/data. So I wasn't even calling the right route. You know what I'm saying? So pardon me. Pardon me for tweaking out y'all. And look, of course it's gonna work now. Isn't that crazy? Look at that. Look at life. You know what I'm saying? Hey, shout outs to, you know what I mean? Alhamdulillah, you know what I'm saying? We coming in clutch right at the end. I'll still pause, but let's talk about where we pause it at, right? So basically we have on our server localhost 3000, right? When I was using Google, I couldn't actually show you this because Google, I don't run Google server. But the purpose of this whole thing is so that we can reach out to our server, this Fable, and get this Fablinks data back, right? Well, in order to do this, no matter what, in order to do this, when you have a server and your server has data that you want to pull back inside like a client-side application, you're going to run into this issue called CORS, which is called cross-origin resource sharing. And basically, security in the web makes it so that that is not allowed. You're not allowed to send data from one resource. You can't send resources from one origin to another by default. In order to change that, you have to enable it on your server. And to enable it, you can use either a library like CORS, which is just built in like a JavaScript library to help make it easier, quote unquote. Or you can add a bunch of different little headers to your particular route in order to do it. I'm showing you CORS because it's typical that most developers are going to use CORS, then kind of define all the headers themselves. CORS basically is a package. That package you install, and it basically asks you to define which origins, which other external origins are okay for you to send these resources to. Now, this little shorthand that I put in here is a way of saying, hey, any origin is okay. Now, again, this is great for like a development server that I'm trying to have connect in a test project or whatnot. But in real projects like Google, right, they're not going to have every origin allow for resources being taken from their server, right, or requests to be made without other particular information being passed. So this origin star is like a shorthand to say, let any origin that's pulling data use this. So it wouldn't be a good idea for me to use this on every single route that I have. But for a route like this one that I know, hey, I need this particular route to be open for people to get to resource for basically for me to send data to a different to a different origin. I need that Fablinks data to actually allow for that to be the case. Then I will use CORS, right? Now, that's basically on the server side what we have to do. We needed to make sure we used CORS in order to allow for that route to send data to a different origin. That's the server side. On the client side, and this is where I was getting messed up, is first of all, what we're trying to do here is communicate to the server. And so here we're actually doing it now. We're actually making that GET request to our local server and getting back some data as a response, right? Right now, that response isn't looking too interesting, right? Because it's just kind of just a big blob of a response. But if I go ahead and tweak this a little bit to get back some of particularly like the data from this response, right? So this response is going to contain some data inside of it. I'm feeling like this is okay for the sake of no risk. That data is not a function. My bad, y'all. But basically, we want to parse the data that is coming back. So if I do something like let data get await response .json, right? And then we console log data. This should be cool. So yeah, so now you can see, we're actually getting back our Fablinks data back, right? So on the client side, it's actually even more simple, right? On the client side, all we want to do is make a request to a particular URL, right? And this is what's going on here. When we get that request, based on the type of data that request contains, we can get back the data that data, right? So I know that from this data that I received that is JSON. So I'm going to use the response.json function in order to get back that data. Now, response.json, this is a function that's built into the fetch request library to allow for me to process this response, right? And then I can console log it. But also, instead of console logging it, right, then I can do stuff like, set my Fablinks to this data as well, right? And in doing this, that helps us accomplish what we wanted to do in the first place, which is when we load this application, right, it's going to load up and go back, grab some data from the server and fill in with that particular bit of data, right? That was my purpose all along was, hey, when this app loads, grab the data from the server. And clearly it's working now. Now we have those two pieces of data and I can still use the application like we wanted to. To do that, right, first thing I needed to do is get the data back from the server. And that's what this whole experiment was about, was can I fetch this data from the server? In order to do that, I have to use a library like fetch in order to perform the request. Because this is a GET request, it's pretty simple. But that request is going to, if I want to process that request as data, I'm going to need to use other parts of the fetch library like the .json function or whatnot to get back the actual data that I need to then use inside of the application. Client-side to server-side communication can be difficult in the fact that, as you can see, now you have two areas of your code that you have to troubleshoot, you have to tweak, and you have to look out for bugs in. So when we link back up on Wednesday, we'll go back over this and do maybe one more example so that we can do it together now that we have all the pieces. But hopefully then from what we'll see is, hey, you know, client side, we're going to be making these requests, fetch requests to our server. Our server will be defining the routes that we want when those client requests come in and sending us back the data that we need, or connecting us to the other resources that we want in order to get back that information. So thank y'all for your time and your attention. Sorry I got stuck right at the end and it kind of threw us off for a quick second, but hey, where there's a will, there's a way, you know what I'm saying, inshallah. So thank y'all for sticking around. If you have questions, please feel free to stick around. Otherwise, take care and I will see y'all on Wednesday.